of 92, if you're following along in the notes. And we were looking at, the whole of it is like called ministry, the church's ministry, which involves called workers. And we just talked about question 26, where we're looking at, the roles in which God gives men and women. And I am going to just do this real quick. I want to get rid of this guy. Maybe we'll put him down here. That's fine. We'll just leave him right there. The roles of men and women. We talked about it last time, and then we dove into that 1 Corinthians passage, which, if we're looking at 1 Corinthians, maybe just a recap, it's not that Paul's saying don't worry about any of this, but rather what he is saying is, well, think about it. In fact, this should be something that you do think about in connection with the way that you worship. And then I would even say you can almost even make that that thought for as you get down to the very end here, even as you go out into the world, right? So in what three areas of life do these roles apply? We would say the family, the church, and then society as well. Like that's God's desire. That is God's desire, that we would live according to the roles that he has set forth. Now, probably the difficult thing that we run into as Christians now is that our society is so backwards that how and when can you strive or even implement these roles? Well, you can make efforts to, right? But I think when we did a study on this, we also said we have to remember that there's not one principle, right? There's not just one principle that we follow. Because if that were the case, then we would fail to follow other principles. And so you have this, the life of a Christian is one where you're looking at the things that are going on and you say, how can I best serve God? Right? How can I give God glory in all the ways that I live in this world? And sometimes that means over here I'm doing one thing, and in a perfect world it probably would be a little bit different, but I'm still going to move forward and strive forward to serve God. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to walk away, especially from that study when we're looking at the roles of men and women, is that, yes, God has set out roles, and that's the roles he wants us to follow, but then as we serve in this world, the truth is that it probably doesn't always look the same way in which, well, it would if it was a perfect world, right? So I don't know if there's any questions on that. If anybody wants to ask any questions, you certainly can. Otherwise, we're going to jump down to here, may women serve in the public ministry, and then explain. Seeing no questions, may women serve in the public ministry? The answer is, of course, yes, they can. They can, and then it says explain. It would just be, we would say, if we're thinking about it, we'd want it to be in line with the roles in which God has set forward. So in this regard, we would say where there would not be an authority, especially when we're talking about spiritual matters, over men. So the teachers, we got staff ministers in our church body. They serve, women ministry, children ministry, all those types of things. That would be, we would say, that would be a place where women could most certainly serve. Any questions on that? All right, and then it says, what two extremes do we wish to avoid when discussing the roles of men and women? So two extremes. Say the principles don't matter because of the world, right? So what that would mean would be, we'd say, well, our world doesn't seem to care about it, so neither do we. That's foolish. I think we all realize that. The other one is then go so far as then to make and take those principles and then place them in a little box that God never intended them to be and say, here's a hard and fast rule, women can't serve. Right? Because that safeguards them from breaking the principle. But that's not what the principle says. Right? So you get to the point where one extent is to go so far and to say we don't care about the principles anymore. The other one is to say, well, we have these practices that maybe at one time we put forward that are that we put forward for the sake of making sure we don't break those principles, but now we have maybe there's a different need, and we're just going to say we're not even going to talk about it anymore. We're going to follow application that we've had, rather than evaluate and think about what's in line with what God's Word says. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see, what did I go so far, start, everyone, yeah, okay. And I think in this regard, I think too, I'm just looking to see if it says, yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. So then we move to this next one. What purpose does ordination serve? What purpose does ordination serve? I wrote down, it serves the purpose of acknowledging the validity of the call and the fitness of the individual. And I think we talked a little bit about this, maybe, was it last week or the week before? Probably maybe the week before. Right? We talked about the notion of, because one of the thoughts was that the pastoral ministry is the only, it's instituted by God. It's the only part of the called ministry that's instituted by God. And we said, no, that's not true. But then we started talking about ordination. And ordination really is essentially acknowledging that an individual is worthy of receiving a call, right? And then also it recognizes the validity of the call in the sense of saying, here's a group of people who have called this person to serve. And I would say, we talked about this too, if I were to take a call somewhere else, I would not be ordained again, right? I would be installed, right? Ordination is a recognition that an individual has, we'll say, in our minds, met the standard of, well, what we were just looking at from Paul's letter to Titus and Timothy, 1 Timothy. Questions? Okay. What is the Roman Catholic error concerning ordination? In this regard, they would say, what do I have written down here? Oh, I forgot, whom do we ordain? Only those called into the pastoral ministry are the ones that we ordain. And then what is the Roman Catholic error concerning ordination? And they list it as a sacrament, right? If you remember back when we were talking about the sacraments, they've got 7 sacraments. Holy orders would be the one that we're looking at when it's talking about ordination. And we would say, that doesn't offer forgiveness of sins, at least when we think about how do we define a sacrament. There's actually not the command of Jesus specifically to say to do these things. And then there's no earthly element unless you would say a hand. I guess maybe you could say a hand would be an earthly element. But we would say it doesn't meet the first 2 criteria, so we're not going to classify it as a sacrament. You stop me if you guys have anything. As we look at,
Pastor,
yes,
is there
please.
anything different with male teachers being ordained with something with taxes? Or I can't remember. It seems like there's something that way.
So,
or was that just a thought to do that?
So in this regard, if you're making a reference to the fact that now teachers also file underneath the same tax bracket as the government, and part of that is just because it really is, it's not necessarily us viewing them any different, it's the government saying, okay, they're doing these things and they deserve to have maybe the same type of benefits as a pastor would. It's not us viewing them differently, but it's the government and then classifying them all under the same category, which then allows them to do certain things that they couldn't before, which has to do with like parsonage allowance and all those other things.
But teachers would all be installed, right?
Yeah, all teachers would be installed. There's not ordained. And I think the notion of ordination then comes to us in the sense that we as a church body only ordain those called into the pastoral ministry. Right? So even if you had a staff minister, in that regard, I think that they probably would not be ordained. Okay. It would just be
because they're not through with their education.
What's that?
Because they're not through with their education.
I think part of it is a notion to say, when we look at the public ministry, we recognize that there are different roles and different responsibilities for specific tasks, and so when it comes to the notion of distributing primarily the means of grace, which we would say is the pastoral office, then we do view it in a sense that here's a position that has different responsibilities, and so we recognize that in a different capacity, right? And I would say, just to highlight, it doesn't mean that I'm more special than a teacher, because I'm not. It just means I have different roles and responsibilities. My roles and responsibilities are more closely tied to, we'll say, the administrator of the means of grace, whereas a teacher's responsibility most certainly will involve means of grace ministry because they'll be teaching about Jesus to the students, but it's not, that's not their primary objective, right? They are called to teach and instruct not just the Bible, although there are some teachers that do that, whereas a pastoral ministry is essentially where you're being called to implement the means of grace in, we would maybe say, their fullest capacity. So proclaiming and preaching the Word of God, also administering the sacraments, baptism, Lord's Supper, that type of stuff. And so then there is this different, we'll say a different category, not necessarily a better category, but a different category, and that's where the ordination takes place. Does that make sense?
A staff minister could be doing more like a teacher almost.
They could be, yeah.
Depending on what every church can call you to be a staff minister for different purposes.
Yeah, and so in that regard too, we would say also, remember what makes a person a pastor, or even if we're looking at it, a teacher in the public ministry, it's the call, right? So the call in and of itself is the thing that outlines essentially the position that you're serving, and that doesn't come from anybody but the calling body. So the calling body can say, these are the things that we want you to do. And I would say in this sense, there is an understanding, or at least a recognition of, like when you're calling a pastor, you're calling a pastor, then you're saying, we're going to have you being directly related to the means of grace. There are people that we would say are pastors, but are now serving as teachers or professors, right? And in that sense, I would say if they got called to that position right out of seminary, I don't know exactly, I would assume that they would be ordained and installed. And I don't know why that would maybe be the case. That one would cause me to, I don't know. Because in that sense, we would say, well, I would want to maybe just think a little bit more about ordination in the sense of what is the meaning behind ordination? I guess it would be a marker of saying this is an individual who has met certain qualifications to be in the pastoral ministry. Maybe that's the only thing that I could say differently about that than a teacher. Even though, I'm thinking, I have classmates who got called right out, and it happens every year. Today, it's going on right now. They have a call service, and it happens without fail that a couple of guys always get called to be, like a dorm supervisor at MLC to teach theology or BHL or other things like that, And in that regard, I'm positive that they're ordained and then installed. And so in that regard, I think it would be a recognition of the qualification of the individual, not necessarily, status before God, but a qualification. This guy has met the qualifications to be in the public ministry as in the pastoral call, but then we'll install him as X, Y, and Z.
But vicars aren't ordained.
Vicars are not ordained. They are installed, but they are not ordained. And that's why I said I think in this sense we would maybe say ordination then is just really more than anything. We would say a marker of an individual's qualifications to be in what we would call the pastoral ministry.
So if it's a sacrament with ordination in the Catholic Church, that just is a sacrament for a very small number of people.
Yes. Yeah. But in that regard too, when you're thinking about it in the notion of that, they would say, not all of the sacraments are meant for everybody. I think they would confidently say that, right? Because holy orders would not be a sacrament meant for anybody who's going to have the sacrament of marriage, right? And they would maybe rightfully say the sacrament of marriage, we would say, is not necessarily for everyone. You know what I mean? So there are certain things that I would say, in this regard, they would say, I don't think I mean, in this sense, the sacraments aren't necessarily, every sacrament's not meant for everybody. They would probably say baptism, Lord's Supper, confirmation, or what is that called? Chrismation, or I don't know what they'd say. They would say those things are meant for everybody. And then they might also say marriage is meant for almost everybody, but not those who are going to serve as priests. I'm trying to think of the other ones. There's last rites, which I would assume they would say is for everyone. What would I say? Baptism, Lord's Supper, Chrismation, marriage. Holy Sacrament. There's 7 of them.
Confession.
Confession. I think confession is one too. Yeah. And that they would say is for everyone, I guess. I think that's right. Yeah, I'm not obviously not. I don't have all of them in my head. But I would say just based upon looking at it, you'd have to say the sacraments aren't necessarily for everyone. And I would say in this sense too, you could say for us that we have a halfway understanding of that, right? We would say baptism for everyone, but Lord's Supper for those who are taught. I mean, and I think in this sense you could say we want everyone to have that. Like we would say it is for everyone, just let's teach first and then. But this would be, holy orders would be just for those who are going to be priests or bishops. And I would say in that, I believe, and when we looked at it, that's where they receive the power to do the things that a priest can do, like changing the bread and the wine into body and blood, that type of stuff. So that's why they'd say this is only for a certain number. And then we would also say, we would disagree with them on this, if we're just talking about this holy orders one. That person then is now always in the class of a priest and will never be anything different because they've went through this. We would say it's the call that makes the individual a pastor, right? Which is different, which is a different look at it. So then define immediate call into the ministry or immediate call into the ministry. So an immediate call is a call directly from God. We would say the prophets and the apostles had an immediate call from God. You think about Saul, Acts 9. Saul's walking on the road to Damascus, and what happens? Jesus appears to him, and calls him into service. We would say that most certainly is an immediate call. The disciples of Jesus, either they come across Jesus or they, and Jesus says, hey, follow me. Hey, follow me. Those are immediate calls into the ministry. An immediate call into the ministry would be any call that is given, at least nowadays, through the church, right? God uses the church to call an individual to serve his church or to serve him. And we would call that an immediate call into the ministry. So a call given through a body of believers. Now, what are some reasons for the termination of a call which do preclude the person receiving another call? And this is the one, I mean, there's maybe several things that you could look at that maybe we would say would require or cause a call to be terminated. Teaching false doctrine would be one of those, right? If you are teaching false doctrine, then the chances are that it would make it really hard for any group of people that you are serving to say, we're fully confident that he's not going to teach us the wrong thing, right? If you teach false doctrine and you stick to false doctrine, then that would cause a termination of the call, and that would essentially mean that you are no longer qualified in this sense to be in the position as a called worker, pastor or teacher. What do I have? Lives scandalously is what the book said. I think when we think about these things, when you think back to what we read at the very beginning, where you're looking at 1 Timothy 3, that above reproach one is probably the one that causes us to really say, has this person's life or things that they have done caused there to be a lack of trust or we'll say a stumbling block for the ministry that they're doing. And I would say all of these things are those, and that's why they're underneath this section. So living scandalously, let's see here, is unable to or refuses to carry out the responsibilities of the call. So if a congregation says this is what we want you to do, and you can't do that anymore, well then that would mean you should no longer be holding that call. And if you refuse to do those things, then the congregation say, well, like you're not doing the things that we've called you to do, it would make sense if you're no longer called to this position.
Is there some way that the congregation where they're at, very unhappy with him, and then, but just maybe he could go to another place and still serve as a pastor?
Yeah, and I would say in this regard, that would happen if and only if it was proven that he was still carrying out his responsibilities. You know, if an individual's carrying out his responsibilities and it just becomes the point where maybe the personality of the pastor and the personality of the leaders of the congregation are at such odd ends, that him being there is not really benefiting the ministry, then that's why the call system's in place, right? And we have such a shortage of vacancies now that you get calls, as you well know, pretty often. And if that happens, that's why there's DPs, district presidents, and then circuit pastors. Circuit pastors can be counseling the pastor and how he can go about maybe mending fences or doing different things. If it gets to the point where the congregation and the pastor is you can just see that this is not something that they're going to be, even though maybe forgiveness is given on both sides, that as they move forward, it's just not going to be good for the ministry. That's when you talk to a circuit pastor, you talk to a district president and say, I should probably not be here anymore. And that doesn't mean he's not qualified for the ministry. It just means this place, this time, it'd be beneficial if I'm not here and another guy comes in. And that does happen sometimes. It does happen. I had a classmate of mine who was in his first call for 2 years, which they're 4-year calls, and he was moved. And it just seemed that everything seemed to kind of just be just always uphill for everybody. And it was just like, this isn't working. So then he got a call somewhere else, right?
Isn't there other places in the ministry they can place them? You know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why when you talk to a DP and the DP would say, hey, I have a guy who's very receptive to receiving a call. Like ministry's not going well where he is. And here are his gifts, here are his abilities. There's some vacancies, at this congregation or that congregation. I see this as someone who could really serve this congregation well. His name gets added to those call lists. And obviously the district presidents include information about individuals that they are calling. Some things they don't include, some things they do include. My guess is that they would probably talk to the other district presidents and say, this situation is just not the best. This guy is really open to a call. He's got these gifts. It would make sense. Not that then the congregation would say we have to call this guy, because that's not the way it works. But they would
Consider.
He would definitely be on the list to be considered to serve in that ministry. Does that make sense? I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Spearfish went through that. There was nobody going to church anymore.
Yeah.
Finally, he had to go because nobody's going to. My brother.
It does.
That was it.
It does happen. It really does happen.
Spearfish.
Yeah. That's long before my time, because I only know.
It was long before your time.
I only know Pastor Sheets.
It's a very active church now, and it had the potential, but there was no one going. We'd go there, and that'd be it. Kim would be playing the organ, my brother would be ushering, and then we'd be the 5 people sitting in the pew.
Sure. Well.
Who was the pastor?
All right.
I don't know.
All right. So, comment: the Lord has not established any particular calling process. So, and this we would say there isn't a set thing that says this is how you are to call individuals into the public ministry. So the way in which our Synod does it, I think you guys in some regards are pretty familiar with it. When a congregation has a vacancy, They talk to the district president. The district president has at least a closer relationship with what would have been the previous pastor, but also the pastors that are there, and he's talking to the circuit pastor, and even in this regard, probably even knows the congregation in a pretty good manner. And then what happens is he says, this congregation is vacant. I'm going to talk to some other DPs, or even guys that I know in our district that are have these gift sets and abilities, and then we place those individuals in front of the congregation, and then the congregation votes on who they are going to issue the call to. That call goes to the individual, they deliberate that call, they either return it or accept the call to serve there, and the process continues wherever the vacancy continues to be. However, it happens every May, which is happening right now, that there's a group of young, bright-eyed, willing, eager young men who want to be pastors. God bless them. And they are assigned to a specific location, and then they go and they serve those congregations, right? And that happens after the conference of presidents, which is all the district presidents together in a room, say, here's all the vacancies we have, and here's the young men that are graduating, that have met the qualifications, have met the requirements, here's their gifts and abilities, and then they assign them to places, and then they go, which is how I came here. Yeah.
We're lucky.
I'm lucky. I'm blessed. Yeah. It's, for me, in all honesty, I honestly can't think of a better place to be. I feel like we meshed very well with Mobridge. So.
Has there any more talk about combining more churches together?
So that's a good question to even ask, at least during this part of our study, because you have to understand who's ultimately at the driving seat of any ministry of a church. It is not the pastor, but it's the people, right? So in this regard, there can be encouragement from, let's say, a circuit pastor or a district president if a congregation has a vacancy, to say, hey, let's think about the gifts that our synod has, and also then think about, what we're asking of a pastor or a man to be here, and then it's left to the congregation. I mean, in all honesty, it totally is, and it kind of has to be that way. Some congregations have said in the past, this doesn't make sense for us to continue to do this, we're going to close, we're going to go somewhere else. Not all congregations do that. Some congregations have combined, and some continue to operate and go because they, in their understanding of the ministry that they have, it would make more sense for a pastor to be there. That's each congregation's, really each congregation's, I would say, obligation to think about and consider. Yeah, I mean, because right now we'll have I don't know, but we have a vacancy tri-parish right now out there, Elgin, Carson, and Paradise, and they have to think, is it us here? We want to call a pastor. We think it's best to have a pastor here. And I mean, there's many things that you could say, looking at their situations. Yep, absolutely. There's not another pastor for hundreds of miles. Maybe it does make sense to have a pastor out here, right? Some congregations have to go say we're kind of far away from places, but there's really not very many of us. So you have to walk through all those questions. You have to think about that. And ultimately, it's not the district president's responsibility or role to say, I'm shutting this down. That's not what he does.
Oh, I wondered that.
Yeah, no, he doesn't come in and say, can't have church in here anymore. That's not the way it works.
People.
But in this regard, it would be on the onus of the congregation to look at the gifts and the gifts and then the resources they have, and see if it's fair to call an individual to this situation. Some congregations can't support a pastor all on their own, and they need those other congregations around them to help support them. And if you have a quad parish and one parish, it says we're done, what about the other three? Well, is it fair to say, well, we're only then going to pay the pastor 75% of what he was making, even though he's probably going to still be doing about the same amount of ministry, right? Those are things that they have to think about, right? Yes, pastors are not to be lovers of money, but there are some, at least I know there was some places in our our church body where the congregations were not paying their pastors enough for them to survive, which is a difficulty for pastors then to say, I don't know how I can
Well, I know
coexist.
they're not lovers of money, but they still have to survive.
Well, right, they still have a family that they have
They
been
have a
called to
family.
serve and stuff like that. So I think in that sense, there are certain situations where he goes, I don't know if I can do this. I don't think I could take a call and go here if I'm going to take, a significant pay cut, and I've got pastors, I usually have lots of kids, 4 or 5 kids. I don't know.
But, you go back to the 30s and the pastors here, they couldn't afford to pay them.
Absolutely,
But the farmers gave them.
Yep,
and-
absolutely. Yeah, payment is not just money. Let's be clear with that,
But
yeah.
it was tough.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. Yeah,
It was tough everywhere,
yeah.
you know.
I'm just saying in that regard, if a congregation is looking to call a pastor, those are things that they have to consider. And I would say in this regard, to then say this is what we are going to do, and we can't do that, that's really not fair. You know what I mean? To say we know that we can't afford a pastor, or we can't afford this, amount of money to be paid towards a pastor, but we're going to offer it anyway, that's not very fair either.
No.
So I think in that regard, that's why the Synod steps in and says, here's a basic, here's a standard, a matrix of what we would expect would be within the realm to be paying a pastor. Now you can look at that and you can say, yeah, we want to follow that, or you can say, we don't want to follow that. Every congregation has the onus to do that. But that's where our Synod as a whole is such a nice thing, because it allows us to be organized in the way in which we call people, organized in the way in which we assign individuals to do certain aspects of ministry that help out, the local congregation.
Well, when I visited Amy in Watertown, Wisconsin, they were like a church here, a church across the street, a church next door. When we went to Mackenzie's confirmation, it wasn't that the church was packed. I realized they have more communicant members, so therefore they have more, need for more pastors, but it just seemed like, why can't they get together and just have one big church? It just didn't make sense in me. And out here, we're just striving for pastors, and, it just kind of made me wonder.
Well, and I would say in that regard, again, each congregation looks at the things that they have available, the ministry that they have and are carrying out, and they say, when does it make sense for us to have a pastor or an extra pastor or whatever? A number that always stands out to me, and I can't really remember where I read it, but it was in like an evangelical book written by some evangelical guy about ministry and striving to grow a congregation. They suggested a pastor per every 70 members. Yeah, that number stands out to me. I think that maybe is a little low, but I think if you really think about it, if a pastor is like intimately involved in the lives of 70 members,
That's a handful.
that's quite a bit. Yeah. And we do have congregations that are that size or smaller.
Well, it depends on how many acting members you have.
Well, but I think the thought is like we would expect about 100 members per pastor, in the sense that when we say that, the expectation is not that the pastor sees them just on Sunday, but that pastor is actively, visiting, maybe on like a monthly or bi-monthly basis, to get through and to contact all these people and I mean, and in that sense, it does kind of make sense, that number. That to me is, I mean, it is what it is. And I think the thought is that this is what we want for a growing congregation, right? You always want there needs to be contact. There needs to be contact. So, which is not, in all honesty, in my mind, not feasible with the number of pastors that we have and the vacancies that we have.
Well, yeah, I was just trying to, they say there's so many vacancies, and I was just thinking, well, maybe they have to share a little bit there.
And that is happening more and more.
Okay.
It is happening more and more. I know that several congregations have dissolved and more serving like tri-parishes or quad parishes or dual parishes are being formed. That's kind of the way it is here, though. I mean, most every place is, a lot of places are dual parish or, well, we have several single parishes. Go ahead.
When you stop and think about it, there's only so many people one pastor can take care of.
Absolutely, 100%. Yep.
When you think of it that way, and yet,
Yeah, 100%. Right? I think it's a very easy to see that the more people you have, the less time the pastor has with each individual. Like that's the easiest way to look at it.
but,
You don't have more time.
but
Like,
since we're so short. you
Right,
know,
right. So I mean, and that's something that people think about when they receive calls. You know,
But there's
the last
some-
call I had to Rapid City was to a congregation. Rapid City's quite a bit bigger than we are, but there's already 2 pastors serving there. And to do that would mean to leave 250, 260 souls, you know, just waiting for another pastor to come along. And then that would put 3 there, which I really think they should have 3. In fact, I told them that. They asked me, and I said, I think you should have 3. But in that regard, they're in a bad spot, but not as in a bad spot as it would be here
Well, we
if I
don't
left.
even have anybody that could serve a vacancy, really.
Well, right.
I don't think.
They're out there. They're out there.
Sometimes there's more history to that too. I mean, just like when all your little schools split or closed down, you don't put the towns that are closest together in
Oh,
one
absolutely.
school, cause a lot of times there's politics. That same thing
Absolutely.
happens
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
with churches. Where
Absolutely.
I grew up, Lake Benton should be with Tyler, 7 miles apart. Those schools are
Nope.
just like Mulbridge and Selby. There's no way they were ever gonna be together.
Yep.
Lake Benton's with Elkton, that's across state lines,
Yep.
just for school.
100%.
But
Yep.
Elkton's with Ward, that maybe makes sense.
There are
Well, I say
Tyler's
the
with
town's gonna die if
Ballatin,
they
that's
go to
even
school.
farther, so you got some
There are-
history going on
there are-
there too,
e-
that,
Every dual parish has
Yep.
history, 100%. And it is, you are 100% correct to say there are congregations that are very close that could not share a pastor because the congregations
The
themselves
politics.
cannot, they're, the personalities of the leadership or the personalities of the church are at such odds with each other that the notion of sharing a pastor is, which is crazy, but that is the way it is.
That's the way
Human.
that-
Crazy.
That's
Yeah,
the way the
yeah.
sinful world is.
Yep.
yep, that's for sure.
So in this regard, we would say there's no divine inspired calling process. If a congregation says we want to hire somebody,
I guess we
that's
would
fine.
have
They
a-
could do that, right? They could do that. What does a person consider when he or she receives a call to another field? Oh, what to consider? What did I write down? Well, prayerfully consider where God's kingdom will best be served. Yeah, there's lots of things to take into consideration. I would say, at least for me, as I have received calls, it's usually about where can my gifts best be used now, because I received the call at a specific time and I can't foresee the future. So, where can my gifts best be used now in the kingdom? And I think to a extent, when I say now, also 2 or 3 years down the road, I think is also a part of that. But where can I serve the best? Which is a challenging thing to do. It really is. Obviously, you don't know everything. You don't know everything. So you just look at the needs of the congregation calling. You look at your gifts and your abilities. Does this match up? Yeah, it matches up. Okay, it matches up. That means I would fit there. Okay, now let's look at also their ministry right now, what they're looking to do. This ministry here right now, where is it going? How could I fit into either one of those? And you just kind of go through that over and over again. You talk to different people. So you do. It's just a lot of mental. It's just a lot of mental work, I think. A lot of talking.
Well, I'm
a
sure
lot
you
of thinking.
consider your family too.
Absolutely, yep. I mean, and I would say in this regard, you can't It depends who you talk to. Some people would say the ministry is all that needs to be considered, and the family stuff will take care of itself. I would say in this regard, to make a statement like that is something that I think I wouldn't do very, very loosely, because I think as a pastor, one of the things that I have been called to do is also to be a husband and a father, and I have a calling to do that, just as much as I have a calling to serve this congregation. So their needs have to be thought about as well. So we had papers at conference a couple years back about that, and some of the guys said some things that I thought, I don't know if I would say it. That's really strong. And I think in that sense, like, if you have a family, they kind of have to be in your mind too. They kind of have to be in your mind too. And I'm not saying that's the decision breaker. I'm just saying to not think about them, I think, is not to really consider this call.
Well, you're not gonna leave if your wife is 8 months pregnant and has to take.
Well, in this
You
regard, I would
probably
say,
could,
that just happened at the Quad Parish. They waited until his wife had the baby, and then they left. Like he said, I accept the call to serve somewhere else, and we're going to stay here until she has the baby, and then we're leaving. And that's, we didn't come here until after Berechiah had hernia surgery. Like, we got a sign, and we're like, well, we can't come right away because we have like a procedure and stuff that has to be done first.
So Pastor, people asked me when you had the call to Rapid City, everybody was wondering, is that unusual to have a call within your district?
I've had two of them.
I know, you had,
Yeah,
they
I see
asked
you called
me
them.
that a lot, and they can't do that. I thought they aren't supposed to do that. I
I
never
don't
know what to say to
I would
that.
say in this regard,
Is that unusual?
district is the only thing that makes up a district is the land that you're on.
Mhm.
And in that sense, I would say that seems, if you think about what is the whole point of the calling process, it's to put the individuals whose gifts best line up with, the vacancies that are there. And then in that regard, I would say, well, then of course it makes sense that you could get a call
Well,
in the
then it
same
really
district.
makes sense that
Yeah.
you would go look that direction.
And I would say in that sense, that is, at least for me, when I had the call to Mandan, it is something that I at least thought about, because it'd be a really good chance that we would see most everybody, most everybody, because that's not very far, and a lot of people go to Bismarck, so, and Mandan's right across the river, right? So that is also something that you think about too. But again, I think in that sense, I'm obviously still here because I felt that my gifts could best serve here at this time. So, but yeah, it's not. I would say, I don't know if I would say it's uncommon. It's happened to me twice, so I feel like it has to be some kind of.
It seems like everyone thought that's an unwritten rule. They can't do that. Well,
Yeah, I would say.
can't.
I would say in this regard, as a district president, I think maybe that just goes to show you that, as a district president, you probably know the guys in your district probably better than the guys not in your district.
Yeah.
And so then if there is a vacancy, there's a chance that you say, oh, I think this could actually work well. This actually work well. And President Free has always been very good at, and I would imagine most district presidents are this way. It's never, you gotta take this, It's always, wherever you feel your gifts best serve, that's the place you serve. And that's a conversation I had as I was looking to be his assistant, I don't know how but it's wherever you think you best can serve, that's where you need to be. And if that's not, at the congregation that's 90 miles up the road, or even the congregation that I'm also serving, that's
I
fine.
think he stayed in district because he was at Bethel, Sioux Falls, before he went to Rapid, because I think
Yeah, it's possible.
I think I remember going
Yeah,
to
it's
Bethel
not.
when they were in the synagogue building in Sioux Falls. I'm almost positive he was the pastor there then.
Yeah, I would say it's not uncommon. I don't think it's an uncommon thing. Please.
But then, our granddaughter's married to a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, and he's been there since he and I think that's 22 years maybe.
Assigned,
And
is that what you mean? He was
Pardon?
assigned out there?
he was assigned there, and he was assigned the same time as pastor in Bickelhop in
Oh,
Billings.
sure, yeah, Billings,
And
yeah.
they were good friends, and we
Yep.
moved both of them, and they're both still in the same
Yep,
place
yep,
because they feel, I know our grandson-in-law, there's no other church around.
Sure,
I don't know how many miles they'd have to go.
sure, yeah, I understand.
And
Well,
you
and in
know-
that regard, we would say, if they did take a call out, in time, we would imagine there'd be another pastor called to serve those
Yeah,
congregations.
probably.
Yeah, but I think in that, I mean, like, I think those are all things that guys think about. Those are all things that they think about.
And they have all these kids they wanna send to school, you know, and
Yeah, yeah. And I think in that sense, then you've got, you know, like Pastor Bickelhop, and your son-in-law,
grandson-in-law.
grandson-in-law. I'm sure they think about that if they receive calls, you know, like, which I know he's had a call not too long ago, Bickelhop anyway. But you think about that, like, ministry, how's it going here? Are things going well? And
Tammy's
they are going well in Billings. Like, they're looking to have another church start, you know, and I would imagine if you see that him having those conversations, chances are he's probably not going to be like, oh yeah, now's a good time to leave. You know, I don't think, like, you just don't. So it doesn't mean that he's not on the call list, but like you look at what he's working on and doing, and it seems like things are going well, and the Lord is blessing it. There's a really
They
good
have a
chance.
vicar too. every
Right.
year.
There's a really good chance that he's probably going to say, yeah, I'm going to stay here. I think my gifts can best be used right now. You know?
Well, when he came there, that congregation was really run down. And he's built it up again, so everybody there, you know.
Why did
Yeah.
stay?
Yeah. Explain the call seeks the person does not seek the call. In this regard, we would say you don't, as an individual, you don't go trying to get called to a specific place. You don't have those conversations with people. You know, there are some situations that like just kind of they move people to a specific location, and that's not like, and this I will say, I don't think that's them chasing a call or seeking the call. It's just this is the only place that works for them to serve. You got people who have actual real like medical issues where they have to be close to a specific place or location. It limits the amount of places that they can receive a call and still be in the ministry. So, yeah. But you're not like going around like a politician being like, oh yeah, this is where I should be. You know, you don't have, that's not you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. Yeah. And I would say too, the reason why you shouldn't do that is because then it takes away the notion of, it doesn't really take away the notion of the divine aspect, but that can be a benefit to an individual who's maybe having a difficult time, who was called or assigned, is to say, this is where God wants me right now. This is where God wants me right now. I was called here, or I was assigned here, and so even if things are difficult, I take comfort in the fact that this is what God has in store for me. Whereas if you do the seeking of the call, then it kind of eliminates that notion of this is where God wants me. Yeah. Bob.
Or it would kind of put your personal feelings more ahead of some of the other stuff, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny because, well, maybe this could take just a tiny bit, and I don't know, is there any more questions on this? No? Okay.
Are we gonna talk any more about men and women?
Probably not in this book.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I just had one quick question, because when we didn't go, there was that question about the roles, 27, we started with that, what 3 areas of life do these roles
Yep.
apply? And, well, so the book says marriage, church, and society.
Yep.
And I know that every once, we talk about it, and then I get it straight in my head, and then it comes up again, and then I'm like, where am I at with that? You know, now it was a mute question because I don't teach anymore.
Yeah. So this is what I would say, and I try to explain this to everybody in the same way. But God, I mean, I think when you look at Genesis 2, which is where we would say this is kind of the forming of the roles, in the sense that, I mean, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because Genesis 1 we see God creating male and female in His image, right? And then we also see God giving both of them the command to take care of the earth, to rule over it, to subdue it, right? So there's this level plane in the sense of like status before God. It's not men are in the image of God and then women are in the image of men. That's not the way it works. They're both made in the image of God. And they both have been given this task from God in the garden. And then you get Genesis 2 where God does this really amazing thing, and He helps Adam understand the need that he has. He needs a helper. And then He creates Eve and brings Eve to Adam. And that really is the foundation then for what we would say it's really the foundational principles for the roles of men and women, right? Adam is the individual and Eve is his helper, right? And I would say this. When God does that, I mean, He's in a sense, and this is in the perfect garden, right? He's essentially saying, here's how I want things to run. That's kind of what He's saying. Are we okay?
Yeah, because I want to.
Okay, so then in this regard, we'd have to say, not only is God saying I want this for family, but I also want this for society, right? Because this is all of the world right now, where Adam and Eve are, right? And this is to be something that they are to essentially carry forth. So in this regard, we would say those principles are things that God most certainly wants in the family, in the church, and then in society as well. The difficult thing about serving or looking to emulate those roles in the life of an individual believer becomes very complicated when you live in a world or a culture that doesn't have any recognition that there is such a thing as a distinction between men and women, which I would say our culture tries to eliminate. But then also the notion that we as created beings, God has said, I do have these rules or these roles, maybe not rules, roles in which I want people to follow. Okay. So we have that notion in our mind. But then what do you have? You have individuals who find themselves in specific situations, and also you have, and we'll even say in this sense, situations that might, in appearances, go against what God has said that He wants and desires. For example, when I was in college, I had a woman boss. Actually, when I was in high school, I had a woman boss, and in college, I had a woman boss. Does that mean then that I say, well, I can't work here because my boss is a woman? Well, no. I didn't say that. I didn't do that. In fact, I recognized that I was working for this company and they'd asked me to use my gifts and abilities to do X, Y, and Z. You know, so in that sense, then I said, okay, I have these skills. They're looking like I want to provide for my family. When I was in seminary, this seems like the best option for me and my family, and to then provide for my family. And so in that sense, I said, okay, I'll take the job. You've asked me to do these things, and so then what I will do is I will do them to the best of my ability, right? If you're looking at it from the aspect of the roles of men and women, and this is the only principle that matters, then you'd say, this is probably the wrong decision. However, there are a lot of other things that need to come into play. One, I have a wife and family who I need an income to support them. And this seems to be the best case scenario where one, I could have a flexible schedule that would not only work with the seminaries, the seminary stuff that I was doing, but also then receive a paycheck that was actually going to be something that we could actually live off of or live on, along with what my wife was making as she's doing her work. And so in that sense, so then what do? You say, well, I'm going to try to hold these in tandem. Okay. If we're thinking about, we could use something even more ridiculous than a boss. We could say a governor, right? If you have a woman governor, should we leave the state? Or should you not vote for a woman governor, right? Well, it depends what that woman governor stands for, as opposed to the opponent, right? So I think there's a couple things that have to take place. One, you have to recognize that we're not going to just say we don't care about the principles and we're going to throw them away. You can't do that. But what you have to do then is say, I also recognize I live in a broken world, and I'm not going to be able, in this sense, I'm not going to be able to hang on to this one principle and then let several other things, other principles, like me neglect them. So your job as a Christian is to do this kind of like balancing act to the best of your ability. To say, I've got a family that I need to support. I'm going to school, and this like so then you just kind of as a Christian you say, I'm going to do that. This is where I'm going to be. This is where I'm going to be, and I'm going to serve this way, and I'm going to look to give God honor and glory in the way that I do that. It isn't to say that I don't care about these things. It's just to say, like, as I live in this world, I recognize there's going to be a lot of decisions that I have to make. And it doesn't mean I don't think about those principles. And I should strive as much as I can to uphold all of the principles that God has said, here are things that are good for you to live by. But you then also have to recognize we live in a sinful world. And so if I were to say, I'm only going to do the thing that I'm only going to uphold all of the principles of God, well then sometimes you can't make any decisions at all. Like there's no option, because there literally is no option.
They're all broken.
Right. Does that make sense? So I think like sometimes, and I will also say this, I think a lot of people don't then also think about their conscience. Your conscience is there. It's given to you by God, and it is there to, one, not for you to ignore, but to actually think about. I had, when I was a vicar, I had a young lady who wanted to be an umpire. And she said, I can't be an umpire. No, she said, I'm hesitant to be an umpire because I would be, I'd be the head umpire, and then I'd be making decisions over the other umpires. And I said, okay. I would say in this regard, if we're talking about a baseball umpire, I would say if whoever you're working for has said you have the best skills and abilities to be in this position, and you look at it and say I can serve these people in this way by being the best umpire, but I'm also going to be respectful of the notion. I understand this notion of authority and headship and stuff. And I would say, for some people, I don't think it'd be a problem. Like, if you're looking at it as this is a job, and I'm not necessarily like above or below, I do make the final decision on this one. Okay, I'm going to serve the people that have hired me to the best of my ability to make those decisions because they put me in this position. But if then in your conscience says I don't feel comfortable doing that, then I would say, don't do that.
Kind of like,
don't do that, because then what are you doing? You're searing your conscience. If this is an area where your conscience says, I don't think this is good, well then don't do that. Right? Because you don't want to sear your conscience. Your conscience is a gift from God. Now it's not always right. Your conscience is not always right because you are a sinful individual, but you don't want to go against and sin against your conscience, because it's a beneficial tool to have. I think what we have is a lot of people in our world they've suppressed their conscience when it comes to a lot of things, and now they don't have a conscience. And I would say this, when you think about matters of adiaphora, which the roles of men and women are not a matter of adiaphora, but when you think about matters of adiaphora, what does Paul say? He says, don't make rules where there aren't rules, right? But then also think about your brother, your weak brother, or whatever. So some things you could do have no problem, but for somebody else that then becomes a problem. It could be sinful to them because they're doing something in opposition to their conscience. So I would say in this sense, as an individual looks at the world that they're living in, and then they think about all the principles that God has in front of them. One of them, which is the roles of men and women. Some women, some men might be in positions where they'd say, this doesn't bother me at all. Some might be in a position where they say, this does bother me, and in that I'd say, then don't be in that position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it never bothered me that I was teaching men and had classes and whatever, until I read this, and it's like, well, should I have been bothered by this? And every time I do it, I still go through that. Should I have been bothered?
So
Word
then-
society is.
So then
saying
I
it's
would
unconscious.
say this. So this is what I would say to you. Can you go back and can you change that? What you've done in the past? The answer is no. So I would say in this regard, this is the matter of Christian living that I think is, at least for me, I find to be just one of the best. Is it possible that, we go through and we do something and we don't think there's a problem with it, but then it actually, maybe there was a problem with it. Like maybe we didn't think things through enough and we did something that was wrong. If that does happen, every single week, what do?
Ask for forgiveness.
We ask for forgiveness. And so in this regard, if you find yourself being burdened by something that happened in the past, what I would say is do this. Go to the Lord and say, Lord, if I made a mistake, forgive me. I make many mistakes, some of which I don't even know about. Please forgive me. And you know what the answer is? Absolvote, the Latin for you are forgiven. You can spend all of your time. You can spend all of your time running around trying to follow every single law that God has laid out in the Ten Commandments. And I don't think that that's a waste of time, but there is something about being a Christian that you have to understand, and that is that God actually frees us from all of that. He frees us from this obligation to serve the law. Now that doesn't mean we don't follow the law, it just means it frees us from the obligation to follow the law so that the law is not our master, but rather it's our guide. And then we go out and we look to love and serve our neighbor to give God glory. And then when we make a mistake, what do? We say, Lord, forgive us. And then we keep going and we keep serving. Because you're right, you can get to the point where you find yourself almost petrified. If you start looking at all of the things that God says, you must do this, you must do that, you must... And I'm not saying don't think about it, but I am saying there are some times where we find ourselves in situations where like, I just don't know what to do here. I go one way and I can clearly see this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I go the other way and I can see it doesn't seem... Like, I find myself in danger of maybe walking or doing something that maybe isn't the best or maybe isn't the most beneficial to my neighbor or to give God glory. And in that sense, then, as a Christian, you look at it and say, well, these are the situations I have. I'm going to go forward and I'm going to try my best to balance these principles, to live in a way that gives God glory. And then after all is said and done, I'm going to ask for forgiveness. And that's me not saying, go sin. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, sometimes living in this world, you have to make decisions and you just have to go forward. And you do it not with the guise of I'm going to sin, but understanding and knowing that none of this is perfect in this world. None of this is perfect. And that's the benefit of Jesus. That's why we desperately need him so much. I don't know if that's helpful.
Very helpful.
All right, if there's no other questions and you're satisfied.
Yeah, until next time it comes up.
That's great. Okay. We'll have that conversation again. That's fine. Then we'll hold our hands and we'll pray. Here we go. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the many blessings that you pour down on us anew every day. Pour out your Spirit into our hearts that we might know what is your good and perfect will. Move us through the work of the Spirit to offer our bodies as living sacrifices to you every single day, giving you glory for, the glory that you have rightfully earned as our Savior and our Redeemer. Move us always to find great joy and comfort in the fact of Jesus. And then, move us then to share his love with others. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yep.
It's totally my daughter.
Yeah.
Are we having Bible study over the summer?
We got together last week and they said no.
He said at one point though.
Okay, I thought maybe you were having those short little ones or something.
Always been, or is your goal to be your job well?
Yeah.
He said that.